Hello everyone, my name is Michael Versborough, and today I'm going to show you how I create a Milky Way photo using a crop sensor camera like my Nikon D7200 and an 18 to 55mm kit lens. So I often get asked this common question: can I take a picture of the Milky Way using my consumer DSLR camera and a kit lens? And the answer is yes. However, the results might not be as impressive as you would like. But at least there's some techniques you can use that'll help you create a cleaner and sharper image that you'll be proud to hang on your wall. First, let's make sure you have all the essential items in order to take a picture of the Milky Way. You need a DSLR camera and your lens, a tripod, a headlamp or a flashlight, and a remote trigger for your camera. I'm also going to be using stacking software like Sequator, which is for PCs, or Starry Landscape Stacker, which is for Apple computers. Now, I'm not going to dive into too much detail about crop sensor versus full frame sensor, but just be aware that a full frame camera typically has a 1.5 times larger sensor that's equivalent to a 35mm film camera compared to your DX crop sensor cameras. So what that means is we have to take a shorter exposure at a higher ISO to compensate for the crop factor, because we want to prevent the stars from trailing too bad. And since we also have a tighter crop, we need to make sure we're the right distance away from our foreground subject so we can capture it in focus along with the stars that are in the background. To do this, I recommend going to photopills.com and using their depth of field table, or you could download their app for around 10 bucks. Simply find your camera model and then put in the focal length. So we're going to use 18mm since that's the widest that this kit lens can go, and then set the unit of measurement to what you prefer. So I'm going to use feet for this part, and then choose calculate total depth of field. Now the widest aperture for this lens is 3.5, which is what we'll use when shooting the Milky Way galaxy, because we want as much light as possible to enter the camera's sensor. So look for 3.5 on the chart and scroll down until you see the infinity symbol. So according to this chart, if we are 15 feet away from the foreground subject, we should be able to have that in focus as well as the night sky. When you're in the field, you might have to rely on estimating this distance, so step back even further than what you think is 15 feet, just to cover any margin of error. So now that that's all out of the way, let's take a look at the subject I photographed. I went to Old Ferry's Landing at ASSATEAGUE Island in Maryland, and there was this old shack that I used for my foreground. The settings I recommend starting with when using your kit lens is f3.5, ISO 6400, and a shutter of 15 seconds. And make sure you're shooting in RAW so you could adjust your white balance in post-processing. Next, stand at the location you plan to shoot from, but don't worry if your composition isn't exactly perfect yet. We just want to make sure the camera is in focus at infinity first, and then you can change your angle or the height of the tripod to capture the best composition. Take your flashlight or a headlamp and shine it on your foreground subject like you see in this photo. You can try and use the autofocus if the light is bright enough, but just make sure to switch it to manual focus afterwards, otherwise it'll try to refocus when you take another exposure with the flashlight off. Now if your camera is struggling to focus at night like mine was, then use your manual focus ring on your lens. And I also found it easier to use my LCD screen and zoom in while focusing on the foreground. Take a couple of test shots until the focus is perfect. My first test shot was slightly soft, so I made a slight adjustment, and the second photo was perfect. Alright, so here we are on the computer with my images, and before I go over stacking with the foreground and the Milky Way, let me just show you the Milky Way by itself really quick. So I'm going to grab these two photos, and we're going to compare them. Now the one on the left is a 15-second exposure, and the one on the right is a 20-second exposure. And you can see the difference in star trailing. Now some people might be fine with this amount of star trailing, they might find that acceptable, and other people might want it a little bit sharper. So you really want to make sure you dial in the shutter speed to your liking. Now there's a couple different ways to kind of get a number to go off of. Typically people follow the rule of 500, which has also been changed to the rule of 400 or even 300. And basically what that is taking your focal length and you're going to divide it from, let's say 400, for example, which is what we did for this particular photo. So this is equivalent to 27 millimeters. So I got that by taking 18 millimeters times 1.5, because we have that extra crop factor that we have to account for, and that gives me 27. Now if we do the rule 400, so we say 400 divided by 27 gives me 14.8. So a 15-second exposure is basically the cutoff to avoid star trails when we pixel peep this. Now this is with a 24 megapixel camera, so if you're using something that's higher, you might want to use the rule 300. So for example, you do 300 divided by 27, and you want to keep it around 10-second exposure. So that's why we use 15 seconds. And let's jump back to the first picture. This is when I had the light out and I was using it to help me focus on my foreground. And if we zoom in, we can see that the shack is really nice and sharp. The trees are blurry. That's because it was very windy when I went out there. And you can see the stars are pretty sharp. And that's because I was at an 8-second exposure doing this test. The ISO and the exposure length was too short to really pull out any detail in the Milky Way here, but at least I was able to kind of figure out the composition I liked and got the sharpness that I needed. Now the reason I recommend using a shutter release cable is because you could get a cleaner and better foreground. So using a shutter release cable, I took a 2-minute exposure. It was 119 seconds, so I was a second shy of 2 minutes. And I was able to stop it down to f4, which gives me a little bit added sharpness, and I was at ISO 1600. Now there's a few little hot pixels here and there that I could easily clean up, but we get a really nice foreground image, and actually I could do this a couple times and stack them and really clean this up even more. But I'm really pleased with just a single 2-minute exposure and what it was able to do. And then I have my 5 exposures for the sky. Now I accidentally hit the focus ring a little bit, so it kind of knocked it slightly out of focus, but it should be fine for this tutorial. This is shot at ISO 25,600, f4, 15 seconds. Now I know ISO 25,000 is really high, but I did it to push it because I want to show you guys how well stacking works. And I'm only going to use 5 images. If I use like 10 images, it would be even better of a result. But I was running out of time. This Milky Way was starting to drift out of frame, and it was getting closer to twilight. But just with these 5 photos, they're going to clean up pretty well. And then when I blend it with this foreground, it's going to look fantastic. So first thing I want to do is make a couple adjustments to my white balance on this, because I want to kind of match this warmer toned foreground here. So let's go with auto and see how well that does. Alright, that's not too bad. I'm more concerned about the sky and not so much the foreground, since we're going to be changing this out. So it looks pretty good. It's a lot less blue. That's because, like I said, I was getting close to twilight, so it's going to be a little more blue in the sky. I'm not going to mess with anything right now. We could always make more adjustments after we stack. So once you made your white balance adjustments to your image and maybe did some other tweaks, go to File, Export. I'll put it in a folder called DX. Just name them Star. Now Star Landscape Stacker, you could use JPEGs or TIFF files. I recommend using TIFF files. They'll give you more control over your images. And you can resize it however you like, and then hit export. I already have my images in a folder right here, so I'm gonna open up Star Landscape Stacker since I am using my Mac. And if you have a PC, definitely check out Sequator. So let me find the folder, open my images. Now what stacking does is average your images together, which reduces noise, and it also separates the sky from the foreground for you, so you don't need to be a Photoshop wizard, which is great. So basically what we're going to do is put all these red dots in the sky, and I like to kind of outline my edges here and get as close as possible to the trees. And if you have red dots in the foreground, you want to get rid of those. So just go to erase, make that bigger. Next, you want to hit Find Sky. And that did a pretty good job. You could always tighten it up a little bit around the tree line if need be. You change your brush size and then just really get in there. You also zoom in. Hit the space bar if you want to move around. And we can just paint in between trees. I'm not going to go too crazy for this tutorial, so I'm just going to hit Align and Composite. Let's zoom out. So it averaged those images together and stacked them, and it cleaned it up very nicely. Don't forget, this was ISO 25,000, and I just stacked only 5 images. So it's a lot better than what it was. So hit File, Save. I'm fine with that name. Now I should have put it in the same folder that your stacked images were in. And what I'll do is drop that into Lightroom. So here is my stacked image, and here is a single image. So let me just compare those really quick for you guys. So on the left is a single image, and on the right is the stacked. So look at that, 5 photos, ISO 25,600, and it looks really good. Now, even though stacking works really well and it cleans it up very nicely, taking longer exposures at a lower ISO and a higher f-stop just produces better results. So what we're going to do is take these 2 images and open them up in Photoshop. Now, if you're satisfied with your stacked image, by all means, you don't have to do this extra step. But if you really want to get a better photo that's sharper and cleaner, I highly recommend doing this extra step. So go to Photo, Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Alright, so we have our 2 images in Photoshop, and I'm going to work from copies. I'm just going to hide these 2. I'm going to put my sky layer on top. And we're going to create a mask. Now black will reveal and white will conceal. So let's put this at 100%. And basically what we're doing is painting away the top layer to reveal what's underneath, which is my cleaner foreground. So I'm going to speed this up so you guys don't have to watch me paint everything. Alright, so that actually didn't take that long. It only took about 5 minutes. And now I have a nice foreground blended with the sky. And I'm just going to flatten my image. Now don't flatten your image if you plan on making more adjustments in the future. I'm just doing it for this tutorial. So go to File, Save. And now we have our new image in Lightroom, so we can do some further adjustments. If I want to bring up the shadows a little bit, I could do that. I could also play around with dodging and burning the Milky Way. Maybe I'll just add some clarity just to the core, just to kind of enhance that. So at this point, it pretty much boils down to personal preference. You just don't want to go too crazy with your edit and bring back noise. We're trying to avoid, making a really noisy image, so just do some subtle changes and nothing too drastic. Alright, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope it helps you guys out. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Take it easy. Bye.